Hi, it's Esty here with Orlando Live at the Florida Film Festival 2013. We are having such a good time meeting amazing people, and one of the panels that I love, it's all about ladies, right? Go ladies! All about perseverance, women in the industry, and let's go check it out.
Welcome. Thanks for coming out this morning. Really excited to be here on behalf of Full Sail. I just want to welcome you guys. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the women that we have here on our panel, so forgive me for reading. But we're going to start with Sari Gilman. Sari is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Her directorial debut, Kings Point, was first shown at the Florida Film Festival in 2012. Since then, it was nominated for an Oscar, which is very awesome. And it also won Best Short Documentary at Silver Docs Film Festival and screened at dozens of festivals worldwide, and it has aired on HBO, correct? Okay. Prior to directing Sari was a film editor for 15 years. She received a Primetime Emmy nomination for her work on Ghosts of Abu Ghraib, which, directed by Rory Kennedy, aired on HBO and premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The first feature documentary she edited was Judith Helfand's Blue Vinyl, which also aired on HBO and premiered at Sundance. And other films she has edited have appeared on HBO, AMC, A&E, and PBS, including A History of Las Vegas and A History of New Orleans, both for PBS's American Experience. And she continues to work as an editor. So let's give a big round of applause for Sari. Next up, we have Brooke Seabold. Did I pronounce that correctly? Oh, good. Okay. In 2007, Brooke completed her first feature-length documentary, Red Without Blue, which has received over 20 awards, including the Audience Choice Award at Slamdance and the Juried Award at Frameline. Red Without Blue aired on the Sundance Channel, Logo, and PBS, and is currently available on Netflix. So everybody go out and watch it. Her short films have screened at festivals around the world, and her film After the Show received the Special Jury Award at the Florida Film Festival in 2011. In addition to Logo, the Sundance Channel, and PBS, her work can be seen on NBC and Currents TV, where one of the pieces she produced and edited was nominated for an Emmy in 2008. Brooke recently received her MFA from Columbia University's Film Division and is preparing to shoot her first feature this summer. So everybody give a big round of applause for Brooke. And last but certainly not least, we have Susan Seidelman. Susan arrived on the scene in 1982 when her film Smithereens became the first U.S. independent film to be accepted into competition at the Cannes Film Festival. Among the highlights of her directing career is Desperately Seeking Susan, starring Madonna and Rosanna Arquette, a critical and commercial success which helped launch the screen careers of many emerging actors of the time, including Aidan Quinn, John Turturro. The film was nominated for French César for Best Foreign Film. She has also directed Meryl Streep in her first comedic role in She-Devil. She wrote and directed the indie hit Boynton Beach Club and the pilot and early episodes of the HBO series Sex and the City. Most recently, Susan completed the editing of The Hot Flashes, which stars Brooke Shields, Daryl Hannah, Wanda Sykes, Virginia Madison, and Cameron Manheim as a group of middle-aged women who form a basketball team and challenge the current girls' high school champs to raise money for charity. So everybody give Susan a big round of applause. Whew, that was a lot. You guys are a very experienced group of panelists. We're really excited to have you all here today. So I think the topic of the conversation today is really just looking at women in film and how have things changed in our industry for women working in various aspects of filmmaking. What's different? What's the same? Where are we going? What's the future look like for us? So first of all, I want to just ask you guys have all heard about the celluloid ceiling. Do each of you, I'll let you talk in turn, but do each of you feel that you've hit the celluloid ceiling at one time or another in your career, or is this sort of an idea, concept you've heard about but doesn't really speak to you personally?
Hello. So I work in documentary primarily, and I think it's a little bit different. There are many, many more women working in documentary than there are in fiction films. So I don't feel like I have externally. I feel like I have the challenges that I faced have primarily been kind of internal and in just kind of learning how to have more confidence, which obviously is not a female issue exclusively, but I do think that it took some time for me to kind of come into my own. And it will be interesting to see, you know, as I do more work, what happens. I'm also an editor, which is traditionally kind of a female profession for various reasons that we can kind of talk about. You know, no certainty there, but so I feel like I feel fairly comfortable, but I know that that's not the case in the fiction world. So,
Brooke, what about you?
Yeah, I was going to say also my background is in documentary, and so I do think the documentary world is a bit different. In the documentary world, or at least from my perspective, we sort of went out, we fundraised, you know, from family and friends, you can sort of grab a camera and you start making your film, and so the celluloid ceiling seems a little bit, I guess, not as established in that world, whereas in the narrative world, and I'm just beginning my career, you know, trying to make my first feature this summer, I feel like the celluloid ceiling is absolutely a real thing. Having a much harder time trying to find money to make my films, when you have to sort of go out into the world, present yourself, make sure that the people who have the money see you and are confident enough to hand you over a check and make sure that what you're going to do is going to make them money. I feel like that's a very sort of different situation, and a lot more is sort of on your shoulders in that world. So hopefully I have not hit the celluloid ceiling just yet, but I'm nervous that, you know, maybe it is on the horizon, and I think there's so much that I still don't know. I mean, once I actually shoot my feature, what that means in terms of marketing, in terms of distribution, in terms of you know, getting it out to the world, I'm not entirely sure what that will look like just yet. I also am an editor, and I do think, yeah, obviously there are many female editors, and so I don't feel it as much in my everyday work life. But yeah, when you go out, you try to make your first film, I'm definitely seeing an entirely different perspective that I kind of just didn't know existed.
Interesting. And Susan, from you, because you came from more the studio background, how is that different from in your perspective?
Okay, this is on. Well, it's interesting because I am a narrative director, and I am one of the lucky ones because I've been working for 30 years, earning my living, making movies for studios or independently or TV, but there aren't that many of us. When I started out in the late 70s, actually my first movie was in 1982. I was in film school in the late 70s. When I was in film school, I had no female role models. I did not know any women who were directing movies back then. I had heard of Dorothy Arzner and Ida Lupino, but they were generations away from me, and there weren't any people, contemporaries that I knew. Women just didn't make movies. The good news is that now, you know, at that time, coming of age with me were a few other female directors like Martha Coolidge and Amy Heckerling. A little later, Barbra Streisand. But the good news is that nowadays, you know, I can name, you know, a dozen or more women that are directing feature films, and so that's the positive side. But on the other hand, there really is a difference between making an independent movie and making a studio movie. And it's all about the financial models that they use. If you look at the number of women who have made great and really interesting independent features, the indie world is, you have to be self-motivated. You as the director are generating your material, and you're out there raising the money, and often you're producing and directing and wearing lots of hats. In the studio world, it really is still a boys' club. And one of the reasons for that is because the financial models that they use, which I don't know if this is interesting to you, but they often, you know, making a feature film is very expensive, so they use this 4-quadrant system where they try to, you know, which is basically men, women, younger, and older. And if you're going to spend a lot of money on a movie, basically the studios want to make a movie that'll appeal to all 4 quadrants. And because the most important quadrant in the studio's mind are the young boys, that is usually why they, in an old-fashioned way, trust or put on the top of their list young male directors, because they feel that they will be able to attract that young male quadrant. But it has so much to do, money and art and the demographics are all so woven together. Fortunately, in the independent sphere, that isn't the case because, as I said, your demographic base is totally different, and your goals are totally different.
You know, that actually brings up a really interesting point, because according to the Center for Women in Television and Film, they said that statistically speaking, women actually make up 55% of the movie-going population. So we actually make up 9 million more moviegoers, females do, than men do. So there's a perceived idea that we're catering to, and I've heard this, you know, since I've been in the industry, that, you know, we're catering to this young male moviegoer, and yet, statistically speaking, that's really not very correct.
Can I add something to that? Because it's very true. Women do make up a larger part of the audience, and I don't agree with this, but what they say, the people who make these decisions at the studio level, is that women will go to male-oriented movies, but men won't go to female-oriented movies. And if you're trying to make a date movie, something that both will go to, it will be more likely have male leads than female leads. There are exceptions. Certainly movies like Bridesmaids and, you know, it got so much attention. I mean, it was a fun movie, but it got so much attention because it proved that guys will go to girl movies. But traditionally, the statistics say that they don't. But we're going to prove them wrong.
Well, it's very interesting that there is that perception. I mean, that girls will see will see the action movies, but guys don't want to see chick flicks, which is utterly silly. I mean, talking about the independent world, there was also some researchers at the USC's Annenberg School for Communication that studied films at Sundance going between 2002 and 2012. And one of the things that they found was that of all the 820 narrative and documentary films shown there over those years, less than a third were involved female filmmakers at Sundance. And the interesting thing was that they said there's really been no sustained or meaningful change across the last 11 years of the percentage of directors or producers at Sundance. And the woman who did the research said that she found as commerce moves in, females move out. What do you guys think about that, about the idea that, going along the lines of we're catering to this male audience, this perception of who we're actually making these films for? What do you think about that idea that women are perceived as being unable to make commercially viable projects? Brooke, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I guess that hinges on the idea that the films at Sundance are commercially viable, which... No, but I mean, and now they are. Now it's sort of moving more toward that trend, and maybe in 2002 that had already started. I'm not sure, but I have to say, I think also potentially there's the question of opportunity. Because I went to film school. In my class, there were more female directors than there were male directors. That doesn't mean when we all graduate, we're all going to be. The men are struggling, by the way, just as much as we are. It's not. It's not. A problem that just women face. But there is a question of, who has the opportunity to go out and actually shoot their film, and then apply to Sundance, and then of course there's 1,000,001 other things that get thrown into the mix when it comes to Sundance, and how those films are judged and whatnot. But yeah, I think that's a really scary thought, because I do think that women could absolutely make commercial films, and again, at Columbia, women were writing tons of commercial work, and not that's female centric. Stuff that all audiences can and would enjoy if it could ever get made. Yeah. So,
well, it's interesting that the woman that actually won an Academy Award was somebody who did sort of a cross.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you have a filmmaker, and she's sort of historically just interested in subject matter that is typically male, and maybe that's why that film did as well as it did. I'm not sure. It was also brilliantly directed. So, yeah.
There are a couple of pieces of the question that are kind of interesting to me. I have a cousin who is a director in Hollywood, and she's done a lot of episodic television, and she was one of the first women in the Directors Guild. And when she's been talking to me about my career and the fact that I'm in documentary, and you know how much documentarians struggle to raise money and make any money, because for the most part documentaries are not commercially viable. I don't necessarily agree with what she said, but she's extremely funny. She said, well, who else would work that hard for no money? But the other, you know, whatever. That's all I'll say about that. But the other piece of it, to me, is that, you know, maybe, and I don't know if this contradicts what you're saying, but maybe there's a way in which women are less interested in making something that's commercially viable and more interested in making something that's closer to their hearts or artistic. I don't know if that's true. It's just something that popped into my head because it's sort of about ambition in a way. You know, is your goal to make money? Is your goal to have, you know, millions of people watch your work and get an Academy Award? Or is your goal to express yourself? So, I don't know.
What do you think about that, Susan?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of even at this festival, in the independent narrative section, I started to look at the page that had all the faces of the independent narrative directors, and this is not a festival for commercial filmmaking, and they were all guys, 100%.
Really?
So that does beg the question, are women just not putting themselves out there for whatever reasons, or, you know, is there this prejudice against them? But I do think I wanted to just address something that was said earlier about confidence. And maybe it's a male-female thing. I'm not a psychologist, so what do I know? But there is something about being a director. Directors are selfish people, in a good way. You have to be. You have to be totally blinkered. Because making a film is so hard. And maybe that's not, women traditionally are not, where we tend to share and we tend to, you know, some of us have families, and which is a totally unselfish, should be, totally an unselfish instinct. But it's almost the opposite of what it takes to be a director. And directing any movie is so difficult that you have to be so totally single-minded and focused that maybe, I don't know, but maybe there's something just in the process of what constitutes a good director and a director that gets their stuff made that's just a little bit different than the way a lot of females organically or naturally are. I don't know.
I think that actually really brings up a great point, because, you know, we talk about women for film, you know, male versus female filmmakers, when maybe we should be talking about female directors, female cinematographers, female editors, because as we pointed out a little earlier, it's, you know, for editing, which has traditionally been a female role, or a place where women are often welcomed into the ranks, you know, there are positions. I think the lowest is cinematographers. So DPs, directors of photography, are the ones who really are underrepresented in women.
But I think that's interesting, because I think directors and cinematographers have to travel, have to go on set, have to work 18 hours a day. There's no choice. So whereas an editor, it's you work crazy hours, but you still can organize your life. You can still kind of have your life at the same time. So there is something about just the job requirement of being a director. On a personal level, I can say that when I started out in the 80s, I directed 5 movies in a row, independent and 4 studio movies. And then I got pregnant and had a baby. And I stopped directing for 5 years because I liked being a mom, and I couldn't figure out how, I didn't have the energy that it took, the drive at that time to do what was needed to get the kinds of jobs that I had gotten before I was a mother. Once my son hit school age, I was able to go back out and work again, but I was then working for HBO and Showtime doing TV movies, which have shorter schedules and are just a little bit more condensed. So I do think that there's something, and because there's so few women directing narrative films, we don't really have that conversation. But in my own head, I started to look at successful women directors who had made it in terms of studio movies. And I, again, it's just my unscientific list, but I looked at several of them, like Penny Marshall, no children. Nora Ephron didn't direct until her kids were in their 20s, so she was already had grown children. Catherine Bigelow, I don't believe has children. And again, I don't have the whole survey, but I do think that there is something just about the nature of the job, and it also applies to cinematography.
And I absolutely agree. I think that this is such a tough industry that when you have to, you either the people that I've worked with in my time, 15 years working in the industry, it was like they had to make a choice. Either they're going to have a family, or they're going to have a career. And there was something about, men seem to be able to do, and we see this, I think, across all industries, right? Where men seem to be able to have both, and it's okay, but for women, we're still being forced, or we still feel that we're forced to choose. Brooke, why do you think cinematographers are so underrepresented
Well, yeah,
women?
we were talking about this a little bit at brunch, but I years ago had a discussion with a female cinematographer, and granted, that's a very, very, very physically demanding job, so I think it takes a specific kind of woman who, is comfortable carrying, 150-pound camera for 14 hours a day. I couldn't do that. But in addition to sort of like the physical drive that it requires, it means that you're managing a team of men, generally, typically, potentially, who aren't necessarily, who potentially think that they might know more about technology or who are stronger. So it's specifically, when it comes to editing, I feel very comfortable sitting in front of a computer and typing away. But managing a team of guys who sometimes have been doing this just as long or longer and just might not give you the same respect that you deserve, I suppose. I mean, we were talking about that there's sort of a difference when you work with your crew of people and when it's sort of handpicked. And then, yes, I know female cinematographers who work with guys that they love and who are supportive and who are, do their jobs exactly as they're supposed to, assistant cameramen and whatnot. But when you find yourself thrown into a position on a TV show or whatnot where you haven't picked those people, and then it becomes a question. You're a woman, you're coming in, and you might have men underneath you who have been in this role for longer, on this specific job for longer, and that might be challenged in a different way. So I think female cinematographers struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, it's the idea that when you're editing, you're kind of doing a solo. You're really working by yourself, but which is such an odd thing to think about because you don't think about women having trouble working in groups. But I did read. I don't know if anybody caught the Dr. Dexler article in the Huffington Post called, and you're going to love this title. It says it all. Women might not be the best bosses, but they're not the greatest employees either. And it basically talked about the fact that oftentimes it's the dynamic of how women work together that affects both how they interact with their bosses and each other. And so, do you guys have any thoughts on on sort of? I mean, let me ask this: when you first started off, who kind of gave you your first shot in the industry? I'll ask each of you guys down the row. Was it a guy or a girl?
That's a really good question. I have never thought about this, but it was a man. But I met him through a woman who was a filmmaker. Not that really makes that much of a difference, but a man named Peter Adair, who was a documentarian and a wonderful, wonderful filmmaker. It's funny because he was actually quite nurturing. Maybe uncharacteristically, he was very much a mentor. So I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a way in which we all have kind of like female and male in us. And so, you know, as a director, I feel like it took a while for me to get more bold and get more sort of focused and maybe apologize a little bit less and, you know, assert myself a little bit more. So I think it's just about finding that balance.
How about you, Brooke?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first shot is an interesting thing. I've had so many amazing mentors, you know, over the last decade or whatnot, but I think I kind of claimed my first shot. I don't think anyone gave it to me. It was a matter of just going out and, you know, asking people for money and you know, going out and shooting something, because it certainly, I don't know that it's handed to you as easily anymore, or maybe it never was, I'm not sure.
I guess I'm talking about that first person who sort of believed in you enough as a filmmaker.
Well, it was actually one of Sari's best friends. my editing mentor, I mean, yeah, female.
Okay, how about you, Susan?
In the indie world, I think often your first shot, you create that yourself. I mean, in terms of my first independent film, it was an extension of coming out of NYU. I stayed in touch with my NYU friends and just decided, you know, we're going to make a movie. But probably I generated that, and I, you know, went out and raised the money. But in terms of the studio, I was really fortunate because Smithereens led to getting a script called Desperately Seeking Susan, which was at a studio that no longer exists called Orion Pictures. And at that time, there was a woman there. Her name was Barbara Boyle, and she was a senior vice president. And she was told that if she could make a movie for under, I think it was the budget was for under $5 million, that the guys who ran the studio, who were the men that ran the studio, would leave her alone. So she had been a fan of my earlier film, and I had received a script from 2 female producers written by a woman, and suddenly there was a female studio executive who was in charge of the project. So it was really this sort of unusually female, you know, this all women who got the movie made, and of course it stars 2 actresses. So, and the reason that the studio let us do it is because they didn't think, for them $5 million wasn't that big a deal, and they didn't have any high expectations for the film. And so it was like, you know, if they lose the money, okay, we can write it off somehow. And so because everyone's expectations were so low, it turned out to be much more successful than they imagined, which was great, again, because their bar was so low at the time. But yes, it was this female studio executive.
I wish people were more generous with $5 million these days. Make something. So how, in your opinion, how has it changed then? I mean, you know, you had that early experience, which must have, you know, because you're sort of new in the industry, it must have, you know, been very natural. But then after that, your experience probably changed a little bit as far as your opinion of how women sort of controlled those purse strings. How has that changed, in your opinion?
Well, it's changed. I mean, I think in the last 8 to 10 years, the movie industry has changed enormously, not just for women, for everyone, just because of all the because the distribution process has changed so much, and the kinds of movies that were made when I was starting out are no longer getting made. Right now, things seem to be very low budget. At that time, $5 million was a low budget movie because we didn't have digital equipment. Everything was shot on 35 millimeter, and it was a union movie that you needed, you know, so that was on the low end of a studio movie. These days, because of the technology and because there are so many more film savvy people, you don't need to shoot a union movie. Things can be made. I mean, just watching some of the independent films shown here, I look at them and I think that must be, you know, a $10 million movie, and the director says, I shot it for $200,000, and I'm thinking, you know, on a D5, and, you know, and it looks amazing. So that has changed things a lot. But so basically what it's done is polarize things. Now there's, you know, the average movie is probably $100 million on that end, you know, all the, I call them boys with toys movies, those movies. And then on the independent level, it's, you know, $2 million, which is considered a healthy budget, $1 million or less. But that middle ground has dropped out. So movies that used to be kind of studio movies like The Ice Storm, movies like Terms of Endearment, you know, those character-driven dramas aren't getting made anymore, except variations in the independent sector. So again, this is just a change in the movie industry that affects everyone, but because the studios are focusing on those $100 million or more franchises, sequels, prequels, those are the ones that tend to get those male directors that they feel comfortable, that they feel understand things like CGI and all the special effects that have now become such a huge part of those blockbuster movies.
And how would you guys compare that those changes to maybe television? Do you see much difference in sort of opportunities for women in the realm of television?
I can't speak to the question of actual opportunity. It just reminds me of a story that I had forgotten about. When I lived in New York, as I said, I mostly worked as a documentary editor, and then I did do a couple of stints on some reality TV shows. And I'll never forget, I was editing a show that was about a late 30-something woman and her sort of quest for love and marriage. And the guys who were producing the show, well, they were all guys. And they were, you know, I'm sure many of you know, with reality TV, a lot of it is actually quite scripted and quite planned out. And so it's actually the only job I've ever been fired from. And I was just appalled at the sort of like storylines that they would come up with. You know, they would organize a scenario in which this guy would be a jerk, and then they would ask her to sort of, you know, look to the camera and say, do you think he likes me? And I remember just sitting in my editing chair, just being like, we cannot do this, and I will not do this. And yeah, I was fired.
That's funny, because I worked on a show, which I'm not going to name any names, but let's just say that there were roses involved with this reality show. And I kind of found the same thing, that oftentimes the way that they projected sort of the women's perspective was maybe a bit disingenuous. You know, it was sort of like, we really need this person to cry. Let's talk to her about her grandfather and then leave that part out and just get the crying. And it was like, really? So, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I actually don't have much experience with TV, so I'm blissfully ignorant. But I really hope that it's for women. It's inviting. I'm not sure. We'll see.
I think that TV is actually a bit of the salvation these days, in the sense that, you know, as I was saying, that middle ground has dropped out, those sort of more character-oriented movies that used to be made 10, 20 years ago. And I think where that's come back is actually in television, and where women do have more opportunities to direct is in television. And I think that that's also where some of the more interesting stuff is being done. I mean, if you watch, whether you like it or not, you know, a show like Girls or Breaking Bad or Homeland, you know, all those kinds of shows are filling in that gap that and filling in the audience's need for what they used to only be able to find on a big screen. And because TV is, there's so much more product, put it that way, there's so many more shows. They need people to direct all those episodes. So that seems to me to be a very good opportunity. The difference is that you don't you're not expressing yourself. In TV, as you probably know, the writer, producer, the showrunner kind of runs the show, and the director comes in and directs it and can put their overlay on the material, but the creative force is the showrunner. But if you can get involved in a series at the early stage before it's fully formed, you as a director do get a chance. You get a chance to kind of influence and put an overlay on the direction that the show is taking. But there's just so many more shows that need directors, so that is an optimistic area for women.
Well, and in television shows, there's so many of the women. There's the writers are oftentimes women. The showrunners can be women. Why do you think that it is so different, so distinct between television and film? Why do you think that exists that way? Do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Money. TV shows are cheaper to produce. And everything in some ways boils down to the economics. As I said, those super expensive movies are mostly directed by men because the men running the studios trust that a male will be able to bring back a bigger more money at the box office. But TV shows are cheaper to produce, and each season might have 14 or whatever episodes. So if there's less at risk for any given episode, and women, again, technically in those areas, like an independent film where there's less risk, or it's self-generated, or in TV where the stakes aren't so high, that generally seems to be where women, or newcomers of all sorts, because we could subdivide that into, African American women, Asian women, but where producers are willing to take a little bit more risk.
So what do you guys see as the limitations for women who are starting out now in the industry? Do you have any thoughts on that, on what they're up against?
I mean, I'm sort of in this position, so again, I think it's opportunity, but it's also just sort of looking around, and the friends that I have that have made their films and who are sort of jump-starting their career, they're doing it because they aren't relying on someone to hand them over a check. They're doing it because they're, raising money, making super low-budget $50,000 films that do really well. Look at Lena Dunham, who now has an entire series and a book coming out, and that's all based on a film that she did on a shoestring budget. So I think that's sort of the path, is to not be relying on the men with the big checkbooks, ultimately.
Or give women checkbooks, big
or
checkbooks.
That
would be great too. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the hindrances for directors and editors. Do you guys, in your experience, do you work with many producers out there that are women? I mean,
in documentaries, for sure. On the film that I just finished, I had a female co-producer and then two men who were credited as producers, but they were a lot less hands-on. Yeah, again, I think documentary it's fairly even. I don't know the statistics, but I think it's, again, it's so hard not to sort of descend into stereotypes and kind of reducing men and women. But to some extent, sure, perhaps women are better multitaskers, right? There's stuff that sort of supports that, and producing is very much about multitasking. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Producing is the one area where there actually are a lot of female producers, and really great female producers, for whatever the reasons are. So in terms of areas, I would say producing and editing and writing tend to be areas where the same kind of ceilings and obstacles don't apply quite as much.
It's interesting because I wonder if, it maybe, or at least the perception is that when it's the men who are holding the purse strings, they might rely more on those men to provide those films, those big budget films. But if a woman's holding the purse string, she's going to, and I'm going to make a really big, just sweeping statement here, but maybe she's judging it more on, less on what the sex of the person is presenting the idea and the ideas. I mean, it's really hard to say until there's a lot of women who are running studios, but that's how it seems. Well, I think I'm going to open it up to the audience and let's get some questions from you guys on things that you're wanting to know. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi. I have two questions, actually. Who your role models have been now? And then also, do you find in the industry, as far as other women that you meet or that you know of in the industry, is there a camaraderie and supportive, or do you find more of a competition kind of aspect to it?
I think that the competition question is really interesting. I was at a dinner with a bunch of documentarians, and there was a pair of filmmaking duo. They were both men, and someone was asking them, who did the shooting, and he said, it's sort of evenly split, 50-50, but I think my stuff is better, and he thinks his stuff is better. And he said, yeah, when we sit in the editing room, we're sort of keeping tabs, kind of. And I was just like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm not that competitive a person, perhaps to a fault. And I have found that in the workplace, women are slightly less competitive, although I also worked for a director once who, I had a good idea about something, and she said, oh, that's such a good idea, Sari. And she said, we should have an idea bowl. And every time someone has a good idea, we put their name in the bowl, and at the end, we see who has the most good ideas. And of course, again, I was like, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. Because I think, I don't know, I really, truly believe that competition is not conducive to the creative process, and that collaboration is just, with hands down, the better way to go. And just to sort of segue into my mentors, that's actually how I learned. I would say the sort of two biggest mentors I have are Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman. They're documentarians, and now they're making fiction films in San Francisco. Rob did The Times of Harvey Milk, which many of you might know. Together they did The Celluloid Closet and Paragraph 175. And they were, extremely generous and willing to admit to things not working. So in that sense, they weren't, that sort of typically very aggressive, competitive men, and I think I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the one amazing thing about being an independent filmmaker is the camaraderie, because we're all sort of in the same boat, men and women, just trying to tell our stories. So there's a sense of camaraderie that's unlike anything I've ever experienced, and I love it for that. In terms of role models, maybe if I had more time to think of this, I would have a better answer, but someone who I just recently ran into and who is a real role model for me is Rose Trochet, who continues to just make work and continues, and directs television, and really sort of doesn't let anything stand in her path. She just makes the films that she wants to make, figures out a way to self-distribute if it's not going to get the distribution it deserves, and she just does it. So I find that incredibly inspiring, and I hope to be the same way.
And I agree. I think that there is, especially amongst independent film directors, there definitely is a network and a camaraderie and a sharing of information. But again, independent film is so self-generated to an extent that competition isn't an operative principle in a way. You're just so busy trying to get your own project made, and you share information. You know, I'm constantly getting phone calls from other filmmakers asking, what do you think of, can you recommend an editor or a DP or somebody, some help. But it's not a competitive, in the studio system, it's not really competitive either, because the studios have lists of directors that they want to work with. So they're going out to the directors. It's not like the directors are competing amongst each other to get that particular job. So.
Question.
Hi. I'm looking at shooting my first documentary, and it's an extremely gritty subject matter that we'll be doing. Aside from financing, which has been, as you know, a fun challenge, but what did you find to be your biggest challenge in getting from point A to Z, start to finish?
Well, for me, point A to point Z took 10 years, so you might not want to listen to me. But I actually can't answer that question, because I feel like what I learned in that time was to listen to my instincts more than I did at the beginning. And I think had I done that, it wouldn't have taken me so long. So it's kind of like the flip side to your question. Instead of what was the biggest challenge, that was sort of what my challenge was that I wasn't listening to my instincts. I think you just have to have a tremendous amount of tenacity. And you have to sort of really listen to yourself and what you think makes sense to you. Over the course of the 10 years that it took me to make my film, there were lots of people who were telling me, oh, it should be this, it should be that. People said, oh, it needs to be a personal film. I actually spent almost a couple of years filming my grandmother, who wasn't intended to be in the film because everyone said I should make it personal. I actually wrote, recorded, and cut in narration, and it was just awful, and it was never what I wanted to do. And I did it because I felt like I thought I had to. So I think you just have to listen to your instincts and just keep going, because it's definitely an uphill battle. And to answer the other question about competition, I mean, there is a lot of competition with money. So that's never going to change. I mean, especially in the documentary world, there's just so little funding out there, and we're all scrambling for like the same grants.
Can I just add one thing that you said? Tenacity. That is the key to everything. Anyone who's made movies or who has a body of work, it's only because they've stayed at it despite all the ups and downs. And it's the same thing for. I was on a panel, and one of the topics came up was about. The emotional, like hurt feelings. Like, how does it feel when you make a movie and it gets a bad review and you've spent years working on it? And part of the reason that some people stay in the business is because they take in the hurt, but they let it roll off their back to some extent. Because if we didn't, you wouldn't make the next movie. And I don't know if, again, it's a male-female thing, but, sometimes men are perceived to have thicker skin. And so they get horrible reviews, and they're in production the next week on something new. But I do think that the ability to just stay at the table, like my mother used to say, you can't win unless you stay at the poker table. And it's true. You just have to keep at it despite all the rejections and everything else, and not take anything too personally.
Yeah, I have to second Susan. It really is the thing that makes us, as regardless of our gender, what defines us as filmmakers. That's really, in a nutshell, what it is, and that's what you have to have in order to be successful.
Yeah, and I was going to say, specifically speaking to your documentary, my documentary took 4 years, and a large reason was because of the financing, because we were raising and raising and raising. But the benefit of that was that the film took 4 years. We were able to capture a story over the course of 4 years instead of the month that we had originally intended shooting. And so the answer is sort of twofold, because, I mean, you could certainly find a silver lining in the just trying to go out and make it, and allowing yourself, giving yourself, I guess, the breathing room, and sort of utilizing or exploiting some of those negatives and making it a positive. And then the other thing, from my perspective, was having shot so many hours of footage, the film that we ended up with was drastically different from anything I ever could have imagined. And so with documentary, I also think it's and we discussed this, sort of just being open to possibilities, that the story that you're capturing is not necessarily the story that you intended to capture, the story you expected to capture, and it might be much more interesting than anything you could have ever imagined. So there is sort of a benefit to making a gritty film and just allowing yourself to discover the story instead of having it all figured out before you even step foot and start talking to your characters or whatnot.
Hi there, I have a question. Had been in the print aspect of editing and writing, so I have more of an outside perspective from the film industry. And from growing up, I just remember that movies were just a big part of the family life, that you saw them together, and I just, more commercially speaking, saw this as the economy declined, so did the attendance of those movies, and I just really feel like independent films filled that gap for many years, and I think it's really brought them more to the forefront. So how would you say that the perseverance of, especially in the independent films, women in the industry are bringing that back, just to kind of bring it more as like a family pastime or something that more people do together?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely.
So from an independent film perspective, how would you say that I've seen that it's been more of a focus in the past few years rather than your general blockbuster movie and things. I feel that independent films filled that gap more in the more recent years. And I'm seeing just a creativity level, increasing in the general blockbuster movies, and I feel that independent films. So how would you say that as writers or producers or directors you had a part in that, and how do you perceive in the coming years to really be at the forefront more as women in the industry? So there seems to be an incline into participation. Does that clarify more?
Well, it seems to be, and I'll let you guys jump back in, but it seems to me too that as the technology gets cheaper, and as it's much more easier to get an SLR, to have Final Cut, to be able to do this by yourselves, you're going to see, we've seen it already, but there's an influx, and that's the reason why some of the budgets have gone down, is because, there is a lot that can be made with very little in comparison with the way it was, 20 years ago. It's still very expensive, and you tack on a couple of big names, actors, and that just blows your budget right out of the water. But that's definitely a trend that we're seeing with, why the indie films, I don't know if there's so much filling a gap as just utilizing, as filmmakers, we're always looking for the next opportunity, and if we can do it a little cheaper, if we can, spend a little less money to make our films, we'll do it. I don't know if I answered your question, but it just... Yes, Jeff again.
Thank you. I have another question, piggybacking on opportunities. There have been in recent years things like, Blacklist for, women in film, and just kind of getting those scripts that you were talking about, but getting those out there. How have things like the Blacklist, how have things like crowdsourcing, how have those things kind of helped, or have we been able to even take advantage of those things in recent years? And if we haven't, how can we maybe take more advantage of those things, to get those opportunities out there?
Brooke, you're raising money right now, correct? Are you using any of those?
Yeah, well, I certainly plan to. I'm shooting a low-budget indie film this summer, and and my girlfriend actually over there is writing it this week as we speak. I was, sitting in on screenings, and she's back at the hotel writing. But yeah, the idea is, to try to shoot something for $50,000 to $100,000, and that is actually something that's very doable on Kickstarter. You see it all the time. In fact, Kickstarter, I think they just raised money for Veronica Mars or something, some big studio film. Because so these crowds they're so important. I mean, as an independent filmmaker, I feel like I get 5 emails a day, different Kickstarter programs, and obviously I'm not the audience that they should be sending these emails to. But it gives people the opportunity to actually make their films, and it is. Not to say that it's easy to raise $10,000 on Kickstarter, but it's certainly doable, and I think it's made it so that there are opportunities for people who don't necessarily have $10,000 in their bank account to go out and shoot a film. I think it's really, really important because, in the independent market, it tends to be that people who have a rich uncle or people who come from money are the ones that are able to go pick up a camera and go out and shoot their stories, and those aren't necessarily the only stories that we're interested in telling. So I think that these crowdsource funding, sites are pivotal, and they're going to cause so much change. Also, I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate, but I think that now it's shifting. The way that it is right now, Indiegogo and Kickstarter, they're donation only, and now I think there's a shift towards making it so that you could have a site like that, but that you can actually entice investors, which is a very different thing, and I think that will completely change the marketplace, because if I could put my film on there and say, if you put $10,000 into my film, then you're making an investment into it, you could be the executive producer and you could see money from it, then it's unbelievable the potential that something like that has. So it's exciting.
Well, just to play devil's advocate for the fun of it, I think that it's difficult to raise money that way unless you already have a sort of audience of people, a so-called crowd, right? So I did a Kickstarter campaign a couple of years ago when I was starting to edit my film before the investors came in. I don't think that I got anyone, maybe 1 or 2 people donated who I didn't already know. So you have to sort of have a little bit of a following to really raise $50,000. I mean, I raised $10,000. 10% of that went to Kickstarter. Another 10% of that probably went towards printing the T-shirts that I had to send to the people who gave me $25. And then, that doesn't even address the sort of 90 days that I was like attached to my cell phone, and that little red blinking light would make me insane because it was like every 5 minutes I was wondering if I was going to get another $25. It's frigging exhausting. So So that's one piece of it. Another thing is, just in terms of the rich uncle thing. So that's also a really important thing. There are a tremendous number of people in this industry who are independently wealthy, and I can say as an editor, at least 50% of the films that I have cut in the past 15 years, and I've done a number of high-profile films, have been with directors and producers who never actually had to earn a living. So it helps if you have that rich uncle, but I've heard a lot of people on Kickstarter say, "Oh, the Kickstarter thing was great," and I just, I planned it so that, on day 4, my parents would put in $5,000, and then that would get everybody else, and I would be like, "That's great. Well, my parents don't have $5,000 to give me," so it's just, money likes money. And that's just true, and it makes it harder for people who don't. But anyway, it was just the Kickstarter campaign that I did was like the worst experience of my life.
Yeah, no.
It's not fun.
And I did not mean to imply that it's easy, because you absolutely have to have your own network, and it is a full-time job. And then depending on your little incentives, that could be your job. Is you're making T-shirts, or you're making albums, or you're doing this, and it can sort of distract you from what you want to be doing, which is writing and shot listing and getting excited about this project. But ultimately, there's the possibility that your project can get to a a wider audience than just your network by, potentially maybe getting on the front page of Kickstarter, or maybe, finding some sort of outlet to get your project, to a wider audience than just your immediate network. So that would be the hope, and that's not always obviously the situation. And again, I think, it's probably 0.01% that's able to raise $100,000 on Kickstarter, but it does happen, and
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, which is the other thing. Again, you can't rely on rich uncles or rich grandmothers or something like that, but there are people out there who do have discretionary money, who are interested in getting involved in filmmaking on some level, being a producer, or they're fascinated with the industry. And if you have a movie that has a specific subject matter, the great thing about the internet these days is that you can, if you do the research, you can find, it doesn't always work, but you can seek out potential investors that might be interested in the subject matter for your film. If you have a Holocaust movie, you could probably go and look and do the homework and look at various people who have donated to funds dealing with Jewish issues of the Holocaust or whatever, and you just have to unabashedly approach them. The last movie that I did, which had a substantial budget, it's called The Hot Flashes. It's a female basketball movie. It was paid for in part by equity investors, and one of them came about because as I said, it's a middle-aged female basketball movie, but we went down, we looked at all the people who owned WNBA teams. We went online, we approached them all, sent out letters, sent out a little production packet, and the owner of the Oklahoma City, I forget the name of the team, but the WNBA team is one of our major investors as a result of his interest in female basketball. So figuring out who your audience is and what your movie is about and knowing precisely, I mean, it's harder if it's sort of a fictional, a drama, or a relationship story. But even within that, it might have something to do with adoption or child abuse or whatever, ADD, whatever the issue is, and going out and finding those people because they're out there, and if you're internet savvy, you can find them.
That's a good question.
I think just piggybacking on that for a second, it's very, very, very smart. Also, when you're crafting your story, I mean, obviously, you don't want to craft your story for an audience that you think might potentially be able to give you money, but to be able to look at your story, to be able to figure out exactly who it's catering to, and then I do think that there's something smart about. They say to us indie filmmakers, oh, you should write a film where, it's all set in apartments in New York and that's super easy to shoot. And it's true. It's much easier to shoot, on a shoestring budget than to shoot some sprawling epic. And likewise, if you could sort of figure out a way to include or, exploit, I guess, that within your storytelling, so that you figure out exactly who your audience is, and then you try to incorporate that into the fundraising process.
And I think what we're all saying here is that it's so important for people to be business savvy when they're movie makers. I mean, we'd like to think that we're all just artists, but the truth of the matter is that just being an artist isn't going to necessarily be enough to get your work made. So it's really important to be considerate of those elements that are going to help you raise money or do whatever.
Speaking more or less from the technical side, because I am a camera operator, say the last 5 shows, I haven't seen like a single female in like the technical side of, they're all executive in charges or APs or producers and stuff like that. So is there less of a want or desire or ambition to be in the technical side, to carry the camera, to do the grip work or the gaffing work, or?
I have to say, in my experience, no, because I worked a lot in reality television, and we held the cameras, we did the editing, we did everything. I mean, they call us all producers, and you could be, that's everybody. Everybody on the show is a producer, basically. But I worked for a company that was actually out of Orlando that was owned by a woman, and I would say over 50% of the people that worked there were women, if not more, and they were in all the roles. They were editors, they were sound, they did just everything. So I think, I can't speak for the other, some of the other industries, but I think there are a lot of women out there that are holding the camera, that are, doing the editing and various roles like that.
Any other? I'd like to know, what are some of the roles that you would like to see women portrayed in film?
I guess just sort of one word comes to mind, and that's depth, but that goes for women and men. I'm interested in stories which sort of evolve and get more complex as they unfold, and characters who ultimately are kind of raising issues that, maybe they ask more questions than are answered. So for me, I like characters who basically just reveal something about the human condition, but that goes for male or female characters.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the cliches that sort of drive you crazy in any character. But I mean, personally, I liked the whole trend of having like action heroes that were women. I mean, that was fun. But I think Sari's right that you just want that depth, you want that the realism and feeling like you're on that journey with them, you're understanding what they're up against and what their conflict is.
Although recently, I mean, there have been many films where, I mean, there's many great, complex actresses out there. One of the, and we have a tradition of sort of art and independent movies that portray great female characters, European directors, male, female directors. One of the things that I find fascinating about right now, though, is that now there's women who do physical comedy, which was traditionally not feminine. So this new group of physical female comedians who are not afraid to be silly, funny, do pratfalls, do whatever, I think is a very interesting phenomenon. And also I think that one of the things that interests me so much about this TV series Girls is that it deals with quite overt sexual material, and yet the leading lady certainly doesn't have a classically traditional, TV female body. And to me, that's also groundbreaking. So any opportunities for women to be on film or on TV in ways that we haven't seen them before. And of course, we want our characters with depth and layers and all that, but I noticed something different happening in the last couple of years, which I think is pretty interesting.
First of all, thank you very much for today. I appreciate it immensely. You guys all impressed me immensely. And I'm a huge fan of yours, Susan. Have been for the last 30 years. And I think you should be, all of you guys should be role models for every woman in the industry today. So thank you very much for that.
Hi. I was wondering if any of you have had conflicts with men either on the set or maybe in pre-production where maybe they were talking down to you, and how did you deal with that conflict?
Okay, so I can't get too specific. But yeah, so I think that, as I mentioned, it took me a little bit of time to kind of come into myself and realize that I could do the business side of things, because I had been an editor and I was in a dark room for 15 years. And so when my film really started getting made and I started the editing process, and then it went out into the world and there was a lot of publicity to do and things like that, I had a relationship with some people who had given me money. And I think that at the beginning of the process, they, I was maybe a little obsequious, maybe a little, I was grateful and I am grateful, but I think that as time went on, I got stronger in my conversations with them, was less willing to do anything that they asked me to do, and they didn't like that very much. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are a lot of men who just don't want to deal with women when they're kind of acting at their level, when they're just coming back at them with the same aggressive style that they're kind of giving you. So absolutely, it's hard.
I have a funny anecdote, which is that after, when I did Desperately Seeking Susan, which was 28 years ago, I was 28 years younger, and I'm 5'1", so I was little. And when, I think it was like probably was the first day on the set. It was the first time I was working with a union crew, so it was a lot of union guys who were, the electricians, grips, gaffers, older guys who had been in the business for many years. And one of the electricians walked up to me and asked me to get him a cup of coffee, assuming I was the PA. So I said, milk or sugar, walked over to the craft service table, poured a cup of coffee, gave it back to him, and then walked over behind the camera and said, action. And I just wanted to see, and his face just dropped. So in part, sometimes rather than making a big deal about it, just sort of let it slide and then watch.
We got a question here in back.
I really admire you women. I do have a question. Once you do produce a movie, the documentary or the movie, and you're ready to go with it, do you find it easy to promote it being women, or is it harder to create a sizzle being women? Is it easier or harder? I mean, just wondering.
The promotion of the movie when it's done?
Did you say the promotion of the movie?
Yes.
God, I think that's so hard for everyone. I don't know if it's specific to women. I just think that's a really, really, because it takes such a different mindset when you finish a film and you've been so creatively invested in this thing, and then once it's done, then it's a product, and so you view it entirely differently. And I can't imagine that'd be easy for anyone. I don't like that part.
Yeah, I don't like that part either. I mean, I've grown to understand that it's necessary, but yeah, I don't enjoy it either.
I don't enjoy it either, but it's crucial to get your movie out. I mean, especially no matter whether it's an independent or a studio sector, you keep thinking your job is done. It's in the can. I shot it. I'm done. You go into the editing. Okay, I've edited it. It's locked, it's done. You go into the post-production sound and mix, and then it changes all over again. Okay, done. But it's not really done until you get it out there in front of an audience, because all the work you've done leading up, all the years you've spent are leading to trying to get it in front of an audience and let other people see what, share your vision. And if you don't do that promotional stuff, especially these days where there's so much information, people are being bombarded by choices of things to watch and things to do, you can really, your film can disappear after all the hard work you've done. So whether you like doing it or not, it is probably one of the most crucial, the marketing and publicity is the most important thing you can do at that final stage.
And I think it's probably wise if you have the resources to get someone to help you to do that, because it is always hard to be an advocate for yourself and to kind of push yourself out there. And if there's someone else who is charged with that responsibility, it definitely is helpful. I will say, though, that I think there's a way to do it gracefully, and then there's a way to do it that's kind of annoying, and everybody knows that, so, yeah.
It's actually a really good question, because I wonder about that sort of that self-advocacy. We've talked a little bit about it, but is there really a difference between how women put themselves out there? And because I hate raising money, and I hate having to stand up afterwards and try to pitch things. It's just my least favorite thing in the world. And I wonder if that is, what do you guys think? Is that something, a product of just, would you say that that's something that women have problems with, or do you think that's just across the board?
I have problems with it. I don't know if that's because I'm a woman. I do. It's a really, really hard thing to do. And we were talking a little bit about confidence, and I don't know if it's a gender divide. I'm not exactly sure, but it's a very difficult thing to sort of get up and sell yourself and sell your work and sell your vision. It's I think it's hard for anyone.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering about, all of you have a lot of experience in editing, and I think over time, editing is getting faster and faster. You know, in 1950, somebody's falling asleep and dreaming, you have to go woo woo, you know, make blurry thing, and then you have some musical cues. And now you show someone asleep, boom, you cut to a dream sequence. And just what do you think about the future of editing? I think with more and more short clips, people are used to seeing things that are 15 seconds. I think feature films are kind of evolving in the whole editing process, and they're definitely going faster and faster, and more leaps where they assume the audience fills it in. So I know all of you have a lot of editing experience, so I just thought I'd see where you see that going in the near future.
I was just going to say, I think what you're saying is really interesting. It's also because I think as viewers we've evolved, so there's something to exactly what you said. The viewer could actually fill in the gaps, so we're not having to show as much. But then also that's influenced by, you know, YouTube, MTV, whatever. All of these sort of. I edited something for Fashion Week, and it was literally every cut. It was less than a second, and I would finish the day, and my head would hurt, and I didn't even understand how people could watch this, but they do, and they like it, and you know, and it's engaging or whatnot. But yeah, I think there's a balance, and again, I don't know. In the indie world, I do think that there's a little bit more leeway where you can take the time to breathe, and maybe audiences will afford you that opportunity instead of it being so immediate and fast-paced.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say that I know where it's going, but I certainly can say what my preference is, and I just prefer slow. I mean, my film is slow, and I want people to just kind of like settle into themselves and kind of get lost in a shot. And you know, as an editor, obviously I've had to edit fast things, and I can, but yeah, I think it would be nice if we could slow down a little.
I have a question for my fellow panelists, because I'm not I work with editors, but I don't edit my own films these days. Do you think that the technology, I mean, I started out cutting celluloid. So when you made a splice, you were really committed to that splice because you had to tape it up, and if you wanted to go 2 more frames to the head or the tail, it meant you're screwing up your print, your work print, because you have to put another splice in, and it would jiggle in the projector. The visual language, I think, has changed considerably because of the technology, that we can do things faster, we can have faster cuts. I mean, we literally you couldn't have a 3-second blip cut when you were using celluloid. You'd have to go through a whole optical process, and it was ridiculously expensive. But I don't know if you started out on celluloid or you started out on digital, but
I started out on Avid, and I shouldn't say that. I'd cut a non-synchronous 16mm film, but that's a sort of totally different process. I think without a doubt that experimentation has been made easier by the idea that you can just have lots of different versions of things. But I do think a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, we can edit so much faster now. And I think that's a little bit dangerous, because I think it's necessary to slow down and not to make changes so quickly just because you can.
And I actually would expand upon that and say that there is this idea that you're editing faster, just like you're shooting faster if you're shooting digitally, when in fact all you're doing is spending way more time. Yeah. You know, and it's the less knowledge you have about what you're doing, the more time you need to get, where someone with experience can get the same amount. And that's where, you know, like I started off on a flatbed, and you know, because you do have to think so much about the edits you're going to make. When I edit, I don't go as fast through it, because I frankly don't want to have to do it 50 billion times. So I don't, so then you want to be a little more thoughtful about it. But people who don't, people who are young and starting now and kind of just learning it on these systems, they often will just do things and do it over 50, 60 times.
But the technology has really changed so much how we process and how we even develop projects, in the sense that this is about script writing, programs using like Final Draft. I made a movie many years ago. It was written by Nora Ephron, and at that time Nora she used a typewriter. She didn't use a computer. This was early days of computers. And I said, well, everyone's using, why don't you want to use a computer? It was sort of more like word processing back then. And she said, because if I use a typewriter, I'm really I'm thinking in advance, and I'm committing to what I'm writing, what the dialogue's going to be, because I don't feel like having to rip out the page or white it out. It's such a pain in the neck to do that. And I think that in the same way that now it's easy to just sort of write things and change it again, that we don't have to sort of put as much, sometimes we don't put as much thought into something because we know it'll change. I think that some of that, at least in my experience in the editing room, is a little bit of, oh, let's try it this way, let's try it that way, let's try it, a third way, as opposed to when you made a cut and you really, that cut was there. Just a different way of thinking about things.
I think there's also a different awareness of the footage when you're working on a flatbed, because I actually edited a few films on the flatbed as well, and there was just, you literally have to scroll through everything. You're watching every frame every single time you are looking through your dailies, whereas when you're editing non-linearly, okay, this is the bit that I want, you click right to it. And so there really is, it's a tactile experience. It's something that I actually, and I assisted an editor on a flatbed too, and the way that she edited, she was just as fast as I am on Final Cut. It was like she was working a sewing machine or something. It was like magical. It was really, really great, and it's something that, yeah, it's sort of a sensory thing that I wish I had had more experience with.
It's funny though, because I feel like I've somehow adopted some of those strategies. I mean, in terms of like, I've worked with directors who get frustrated with me because they know, like, if they see the clip, they know where it is, but I kind of insist on going through because I need to see where it is in the context. And then the other thing in terms of the ability to make changes really quickly, something that I found is that usually the first cut that I make, my instincts are right. And I might go back and change it, and then I will change it back to the way it was originally. So I remember the first feature that I edited, is very, just kind of neurotic. And at the end, I went through every single cut and moved it a frame in each direction to make sure that I had gotten the exact right frame that I wanted. And I found that I kind of had. And so I think that, yeah, you can try all these different things, but if you just kind of like calm down and realize that you don't have to, that your first instinct might just be right.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. Oh, yes.
Okay, so this is just a fantasy question. If you could direct any kind of feature film and maybe give us a reference to maybe something similar, what would it be? Because I'm dying to see that, whatever that blockbuster is, with the female name right up in bold letters, right on top. So what would that film be?
You're talking about a film that's already been made, right?
Oh, a film that's already been made. Oh, wait.
And what you want, and like a reference that.
Honestly, mine would probably be Pan's Labyrinth. Pan's Labyrinth. Just because I love the mystical realism, but I also like it was action, it was fast-paced, it was dark, it was beautiful, it was well-acted, and I just really like the story, so that's the first one that comes to my mind.
I'm not usually good with these kinds of questions because I feel like it changes from second to second with me. But like, I think at this point, I might say the movie Amour, which just came out, which is about a very similar subject matter to my film. It's about an aging couple, but I loved how slow it was and how the shots were framed and everything was very quiet. I thought it was a beautiful movie. So.
I guess I'll say that the movie that inspired me to be a filmmaker, which was Boys Don't Cry, which was directed by a woman. So nice. Yeah, but it has a lot of heart, and it spoke to a lot of people, and I think that would be an amazing feat.
If I could have directed one other movie that somebody else directed, I think it would probably be Chinatown. Because I think it's brilliant on every level, visually, story-wise, performance-wise. It's about something, and it's a genre movie that's about something. And to me, it's sort of like in my opinion, the perfect movie.
And what's yours?
The Avengers. Big popcorn. Save the world.
Well, I just want to thank, first and foremost, our panelists for spending their time today and their thoughts and opinions, and all of you guys for attending. Had a lot of fun, and thank you.